Good morning and welcome to Ask Andy. This is a daily podcast about personal injury practice in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm Andrew Neuwirth. So I wanted to talk to you today about situations where you are rear-ended in a car crash. Now, the easy ones are you're stopped at a red light and someone crashes into the back of you. What does that mean for your personal injury case? Well, first of all, I know this is this is very basic to me, but there are two things I try and tell clients at the outset of these cases. One, you're going to win your case. Okay, there's not going to be ever a discussion about who is at fault because there's no excuse for running into the back of someone's car. So these are the easier cases for lawyers in terms of the grand scheme of all cases possible. Now, the caveat or the exception to that you're going to win your case is if you're limited tort, then you got to show that you have serious impairment of bodily function, which is, getting more into the harder lawyering and some of the proof and this and that in your medical records. So, but in terms of the basic rear-ended case, there's never an excuse for rear-ending somebody. I know that's kind of basic to me, but, in terms of what the driver who hit you was doing, well, what were they doing? They weren't paying attention, or they were going too fast, or, any number of other things, none of which are okay. So, there are a couple legal aspects that play into this, but one of them is, I've had situations where people are rear-ended at fairly high speed because someone was driving along and they hit their brakes and they skidded on oil that they couldn't see on the ground or on rain or on dirt or, who knows what. But the law is exquisitely clear that, roadway debris, roadway oil, rain, these are all things that are not excuses for not being able to stop your car. Okay, it's called the sudden emergency doctrine. And the only thing that really is known as a sudden emergency that is an exception for, liability is if a deer runs out in front of you or something like that. Okay? So, absent the deer situation, you're going to be responsible if you hit somebody from behind. And so in the person in the vehicle that's hit from behind, what usually happens to them? Well, oftentimes you were sitting there, at the light, weren't really expecting to get a hit from behind. And oftentimes the person who's doing the hitting was expecting to slow their vehicle down and was, would have hit you at a lot higher speed than they would have normally had they been paying attention. So, what does that mean? That means that you take a fairly hard shot from behind when you're in these rear vehicle accidents. I've had plenty of situations where there's really minor damage on your vehicle and there's major damage on the other vehicle. I've had situations where there's minor damage on your vehicle and minor damage on the other vehicle. And I've had situations where, people got hit from behind by a bus and the whole back of the car is destroyed. One of the wrinkles in these cases is, well, what happens if a car, two cars back, runs into a car behind you and hits that car, and sort of you're the third car in the chain reaction, So what happens in that situation? Well, in that situation, the car that hit you is actually not the car at fault, right? So is that car that hit you, kind of the chain reaction car, is that person liable or responsible in any way to you? And generally the answer is no. Now, if you're paralyzed or killed or have some, tremendous injury, from which you won't recover, then, we have to start looking at that in-between car and see if there's an argument to be made that they may have some liability, even if it's only 10 or 25%. But usually the in-between car and you are in the same situation. You were both hit from behind as a result of this negligent driver's actions. Okay? But look, let's say you're full tort and you're rear-ended. You're gonna win your case. End of story, full stop. Just a question of when and for how much. So what sort of injuries occur when you're hit from behind as opposed to being hit from in front? Well, hit from behind injuries are often, for some reason, lower back injuries, and rotator cuff injuries happen a fair amount, and there's a decent amount of concussions that come out of this. So, basically, the injury sort of process that we see as lawyers following these traumatic car accidents is all of this energy from the striking vehicle ends up in your kind of passenger compartment and goes into your body and then passes through into the vehicle. So you take a pretty substantial shot of energy into your lower back, and you're kind of unprepared for it. People who are more prepared for it, like who brace themselves on the steering wheel because they see it coming, usually suffer, kind of rotator cuff, shoulder, and wrist injuries because that energy goes through you and kind of transfers into the steering wheel that doesn't have any give to it. So, look, that's usually what we see in these rear-end car accidents. They're kind of the routine, easier accidents. Unfortunately, if you have, pre-existing conditions and you're more at risk in these rear-end situations, you're going to take, a worse injury or a worse shot from the same amount of injury as somebody else would. So, if you've got a prior back surgery or prior back hardware, and all of a sudden, you're hit from behind by someone not paying attention at high speed, you're gonna suffer more than I might or someone else might. So, that's it. I think that's pretty much the basic rear-end car accident. In terms of what happens during the lawsuit, if we can't settle the case, I'll take the deposition of the person who hit you, and, the deposition is something along the lines of, why this happened? Well, I didn't expect the light to change. Sometimes I've had people say, I dropped, chicken nuggets in my lap, or I was reaching for something on the ground, or I just looked away for a split second. None of that is terribly believable, and it's an effort by the defendant driver to minimize, one, their conduct, even though their lawyer knows they're 100% at fault. And then they usually say, and the damage was minimal, which may or may not be true. And they also say the driver of the car I hit looked fine. Okay, so it's all an effort to minimize conduct that everybody knows is wrong. So, why are they minimizing conduct? Well, in the deposition, all you really want to see is that, what they're going to say. I can test what they're going to say, but the purpose of the deposition oftentimes is to get their story down on the transcript and know what they're going to say for trial. It's not usually terribly impactful if the person's trying to minimize their negligent conduct. That's sort of what I would expect. What's more surprising sometimes is people come in and say, yeah, no, I'm 100% at fault. Okay, thanks. And that's actually an easier, more pleasant deposition, and it's actually the truth. People who try and minimize are really trying to reduce their culpability, their blameworthiness, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, except it's sort of human nature, I think. You don't want someone to tell you did wrong. It's very hard for people to appreciate that they've done something wrong and to say it or to admit it. But if you have a lot of insurance, then why don't you just say, yep, I'm at fault. End of story. Full stop. Pay the insurance. I never quite understood why people with a lot of insurance, fight with me on who's at fault. So, mostly it's because they don't want to admit they're at fault, or because their insurance paid for their lawyer and their lawyers tell them, well, I'll try and minimize your conduct. I don't really get why most people who say, yep, I was at fault, my fault, I did it, that's the easiest deposition for both sides, and it's the truth. So as you work your way away from the truth, the depositions get more and more confrontational, contentious, and really, frankly, if you hit someone from behind at high speed, you're going to look kind of stupid in the eyes of just about anyone. So why not just, admit your conduct and move on? So that's kind of my view of the rear end car crash. But these are the easy ones. We're happy to handle them. Most of the times we take a real firm line on demand and what the case is worth. All right, so this is not legal advice. This is just me musing on my practice and what I see in Philadelphia car crashes. I hope you have a great day, and we're heading into a nice time of year here. So take care. I hold people accountable.